Did I think that I was going to spend today talking about Modern Horizons 3 spoilers? No, I did not. Am I absolutely hyped that I get to do that? Oh, yeah. Also, future Phil here. I got so excited recording this video that I didn't stop to do any of my sponsor stuff, so let me just shout them out real quick. Should you find that you need any of the cards that you see in today's video, when pre-orders start going up, check out toamagic.com. That's Tales of Adventures. They're such a great place to buy from. They support legacy content creators like myself, and they have a lot of high power cards. So if you are a vintage gamer, a legacy gamer, and you want some broken cards, they're a great place to shop. And should you find that you need to put your deck lists online, moxfield.com is just a no-brainer place to go. I've got 400 or 500 deck lists up on my Moxfield at this point. That is about the best recommendation that I can give. All right, let's get into it. Hello folks, Phil Gallagher aka ThrabenU here for another Legacy video, and rather than gameplay today, we're going to be talking about spoilers. So for some context here, there was a massive leak of Modern Horizons 3 cards, which is set to be a June release, and we were about 3 weeks away from the previews fully starting for this when a bunch of stuff got leaked. And Wizards of the Coast always likes to kind of build this narrative, give out spoilers to content creators, and that maybe wasn't going super smoothly this time around. So they decided to just kind of go like, fuck it. Here's a bunch of stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about what's coming since it's leaking out anyway. So today I'm just going to roll through a bunch of these cards and talk about where my head is at with them with like legacy deck building. And the cards that were previewed today are just kind of disgusting. Like, this wasn't even formal preview season, and we got like potentially format changing cards already. So buckle up, this summer is going to be wild for Legacy. Let's start with Winter Moon. Players can't untap more than one non-basic land during their untap steps. This card is pretty cool. So fundamentally, this card is obviously a amalgamation of like Winter Moon and Blood Moon effects, right? Like hence the name Winter Moon. Winter Orb is something that is often played in an aggressive Ancient Tomb deck where, you Ancient Tomb and do this, you untap your Ancient Tomb, you are untapping more mana per turn than your opponent on average. Blood Moon often gets played in prison decks or aggressive decks, and Back to Basics often gets played in these sort of like control decks that are very heavy on basics. So what are we doing with Winter Moon specifically? So this is incentivizing you to play basic lands so that you get an untapped step and your opponents don't. Like, if you untap all of your lands, if you untap 3 or 4 lands, your opponent's 1, you have a massive mana advantage generated by this card. But this is going to be fundamentally different from Blood Moon or Winter Orb that the card is named after, in that this doesn't slot super well into Ancient Tomb decks, right? If you are an Ancient Tomb deck, you would probably prefer to just Blood Moon your opponent and attempt to turn off all of those lands permanently. This denies multiple untap steps. This does not deny colors like something like Blood Moon might. So you probably want this in an aggressive creature-based deck that is heavy on basic lands. The issue is that many decks that would fit that bill, like say Merfolk, actually play a surprising number of utility lands despite being a basic heavy deck. Alternatively, you can use this in a basic land-based control deck list, like some blue-white X deck list that is very heavy on basics, and use this to generate a mana advantage in the same sort of way that Back to Basics does. But this one doesn't pitch to, say, Force of Will or Force of Negation like Back to Basics does. This one does come down earlier. I'm not sure if that matters since it doesn't just permanently lock out the lands, it just reduces the number of untapped steps. So this might be useful for, say, a control deck that wants to fight against a big mana ramp deck like Cloudpost, or a deck with just a ton of non-basic lands like lands. This feels like a niche player to me, but this is an incredibly unique, aggressively costed card. It might slip through and see a little bit more play than what I'm expecting here. While we're kind of in the Ancient Tomb mindset, let's talk about Ugin's Labyrinth really quick. This one's neat. This is a colorless producing land at its base, but if you imprint a colorless card with mana value 7 or greater from your hand, it instead taps for 2 mana instead. And later on, you can tap this to return the exiled card to its owner's hand. This is perhaps going to be a more interesting card for Modern than Legacy. I saw someone, I think it was Caleb D, just like immediately tweet out, Chalice of the Void on turn 1 in Modern. And yeah, that is a thing that you are allowed to do. Here's kind of my problem with this in Legacy specifically. In your decks that are playing large colorless cards, they don't actually play that many copies of them. They're tutoring up, your Ugins and your Emrakuls and all those sorts of things instead of just having many copies of them. So I think the chances of you just being able to play this as an additional Ancient Tomb that does not cost you life are pretty low in Legacy specifically. If in Modern, you are playing a giant pile of All Is Dusts and Eldrazi and things like that, like that's pretty interesting to me as an avenue to get ahead early on, which is something that those decks often lack. You're often like setting up Tron lands or something like that in order to get to your big payoff cards, and this could help you get out of the early game, crack expedition maps earlier or whatever. It wouldn't surprise me for some people to mess around with this in Legacy, but given that a lot of the Cloudpost decks are looking to play Primeval Titan, which is a 6-mana green card, as their best payoff, I don't think this one quite fits. Let's maybe talk about one that does fit. Let's talk Planar Nexus real quick. All right, so this is an untapped land that produces a colorless, or it can filter into a mana of any color. It is every non-basic land type, such as cave, desert, gate, lair, locust, mine, power plant, tower, Urza's, sphere. This card synergizes really well with things that were already good. All right, so let's take a look at Planar Nexus one more time here. So it's every non-basic land type, right? Just at the same time. So if you control an Urza's Mine, an Urza's Power Plant, add 3 instead. So I believe that if you control this wonderful thing, it is a power plant. It is a mine. This is a way to enable these Urza's lands to produce their additional mana without jumping through the hoops of tutoring for all 3 pieces. So you can play one of you can play a playset of each one of these, a playset of your Nexus, and have an incredible chance at either assembling your Urzatron naturally or assembling at least one piece of it so that each one of these is, at least a soul land worth of value, or a tri-land in the case of Urza's Saga. And the clunkiness of needing to assemble 3 pieces for these to produce additional mana has kept this from being Legacy viable for a very long time. Maybe that changes that. And I want to bring Urza's Workshop back into play here. This is something that I've been pretty suspicious of because it requires Metalcraft, and then you tap to add mana for each Urza's land that you control. Oh, we've got another Urza land that we should put up here. Let's not forget our good friend Urza's Saga while we are talking about Urza's lands here. So you can build a mana base with 4 tower, 4 power plant, 4 mine, 4 Urza's Workshop, 4 Urza's Saga, a handful of artifacts to kind of make the rest of the deck pop off, and have a deck that can incredibly consistently do something that produces additional mana, you're maybe not always going to have that, like, oh, this is just 2 mana on Ancient Tomb. Sorry, 2 mana on turn 1, like Ancient Tomb or City of Traders might be. But the Urza lands might be worth revisiting by legacy standards with the release of this card, and that's exciting. The other thing is that it's also a locus, right? And that means that it gets easier and easier for Cloud Post to produce more life and Glimmer Post to gain you more life. One of the problems with these sorts of cards is that Vesuva has always entered tapped just kind of due to its very nature, and Thespian Stage is slow. These like 8 post, 12 post, 16 post, 20 post, question mark, question mark, question mark decks potentially get more consistent. And the decks in the past few years have gone into green for things like Primeval Titan and Elvish Reclaimer. Maybe if you get a critical density of good colorless lands, you can go back to just straight being a colorless deck. I'm not entirely sure, but it's something that I'm definitely thinking about. These lands are good. Oh, hey, did I mention we were also getting another Urza's land beyond that? Did that like not come up yet? Enter Urza's Cave. Search your library for a land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So this is a 3 mana and sacrifice effect. But this is really powerful. And I want to remind you that Legacy is a format of Life from the Loam. This is a way on a land to just have a tutor for another land, and it goes directly into play. This is a very powerful card, and I think it is very easy to think of ways that this can be broken. But I want to kind of put the brakes on this one for a minute, because I think the way that many land-based decks in Legacy are built actually means that this one isn't as good as it initially looks. Like, I saw this and went, that's cracked. And then I thought about it for 5 more minutes and I went, maybe not. So I have here on screen a random green-white sphere lands deck. And I'm going to rearrange this in a way that shows off a very important lesson. So I have rearranged the lands here so that the lands that produce colored mana are on the left, and the lands that produce either colorless mana, no mana, or mana that is not green or white are on the right. And when you look at any sort of lands deck, there's going to be just so many colorless lands in the deck already, because they are a fundamental part of the deck. You need your wastelands. You need your land-based win conditions, which usually come in the form of Dark Depths and Thespian Stage or Urza's Saga. And you often have some sort of additional mana denial, Rishadan Port, Ghost Quarter, some amount of other utility lands, your Maze of Iths, your Tabernacles, your Blast Zones, that sort of stuff. So going back to our spoiler of Urza's Cave here, when I first think about this card, I think, oh man, like this card is really good. It lets you tutor for whatever combo piece you're missing. It lets you find your Urza's Saga. Then you can recur it with Life from the Loam. Like, that's so good. And then when I practically start thinking about the lands lists, and I think about how many colorless producing lands are already in the deck, like, is this better than many of the lands that are already in the deck for specific utility purposes? When you already can dredge through your deck with Life from the Loam, use crop rotations, Sylvan Scryings to tutor, and all of a sudden I was a lot less excited about this card than I initially expected that I might be. So let's make one other comparison to a recently printed land, and that's Echoing Deeps. Echoing Deeps can enter the battlefield tapped as a copy of any land card in a graveyard, except it's a cave in addition to its other types. This was a card that I thought was going to see a little bit of play, and it kind of sees fringe utility play. I'm not surprised when I see it, but it's maybe not going to be on the forefront of my mind when playing against land-based decks. This is something that kind of lets you recur a land. It doesn't require you to throw mana into it because effectively it's 4 mana to do this whole Urza's Cave thing, right? Because it's 3 mana plus tapping this, which is kind of like your 4th mana. So this is actually relatively slow. This is really good utility on a land, but like imagine when your tutor gets wastelanded. Like, ugh, that feels a little gross. The next one is neat, and I'm not going to lie, I read this one wrong the first time. Okay. So Kudo, King Among Bears, green and a white for a 2/2. Other creatures have base power and toughness 2/2 and are bears in addition to their other types. Okay, let's see if you just heard that correctly. This is other creatures. This is not other creatures you control. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. This is a creature that you can commonly tutor off of things like Green Sun's Zenith, off of things like Fiend Artisan, that just makes all of your opponent's creatures into 2/2 bears. Now, they have base power and toughness 2/2 and are bears in addition to their other types. They're still going to have their other abilities. But if your opponent puts some giant 7/7 creature into play, you go, nope, that's a 2/2. And that is really, really cool. So this can maybe backfire sometimes where you actually end up increasing the size of your opponent's creatures due to, maybe it's a 0/0 with some +1 counters on it or something like that. But this is a really neat way to snap combat in half. Like, if you have a bunch of base 2/2 bears and, like, you have lords that make your bears bigger, or you have a bunch of +1/+1 counters or equipment or something like that, like, you can probably build your deck in a way that allows you to asymmetrically break this card. This is very intriguing to me, and I absolutely expect at some point we'll be playing against Maverick, or I'll be playing Maverick, and someone will just green sun this up and just absolutely spin a board state just instantly by playing this card. It's also interesting with token producers. If you can make a whole bunch of 1/1s, like all of a sudden they are 2/2 bears instead, you increase the power. Maybe you play this alongside, your germ tokens that are normally 0/0s. Now they're 2/2s. This is incredibly intriguing to me. I don't know how good it actually is, but it's very unique. All right, kid gloves are off now. This is probably the card that I am most excited about from today. I think this one might be format changing levels of good. And I do not say that lightly. Wight of the Reliquary, which is just a fantastic A+ name. Zombie Knight, Vigilance, +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard. 2/2 baseline stats, not die into Orcish Bowmasters. Sacrifice another creature, search your library for a land card, and put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So I don't even know where to start about like how excited I am about this card. This card is insane. So, number one, this is a relatively large scaling body. And this is something, these sorts of cards see a lot of play in Legacy. Let's take a look at some. Okay. So, if you think about most of the creatures that see play in assorted green mid range decks, a huge portion of them grow as additional things are hitting the graveyard. Oftentimes, creatures or lands are the most common, whereas something like Tarmogoyf draws on a slightly wider pool. This card that we're looking at here grows for the creature cards in your graveyard, which is perfectly fine and good, and gives you a way to put things into said graveyard. And that should sound incredibly familiar. Glimpse of Nature Elves is essentially dead, and Fiend Artisan Elves or Reclaimer Elves is kind of the new king of decks in that style. And these sorts of decks thrive on a Fiend Artisan package, where you can tutor up a Grist. You can tutor up your Collector Oof as a Silver Bullet. You can just tutor up another Fiend Artisan. And a lot of times you can sacrifice a mana dork that you don't care about, or maybe even just a token off an Orcish Bowmasters. Let's go ahead and pull up a Fiend Artisan Elves deck list, and I think it is going to show you exactly how busted this card is going to be. Alright, so at a fundamental level, something that these Fiend Artisan Elves decks are trying to do is be able to funnel a large amount of mana into either Fiend Artisan or maybe an Allosaurus Shepherd. And Fiend Artisan is often very good with Gaia's Cradle. You produce a decent number of bodies. This build that I randomly pulled is very much on the green side rather than the green-black side, but Orcish Bowmasters is often here. And you will often go and use things like your Orcish Bowmasters or your abundance of elf bodies to funnel a bunch of mana into Gaia's Cradle. And, that can eventually just lead into Fiend Artisan into Craterhoof. But sometimes mana is a choke point and you don't get to go and activate your Fiend Artisan for infinite value. Well, guess what? Now you can have your cake and eat it too, because you have one source of tutoring that gets you your Gaia's Cradle. You have another source of tutoring that gets you all of your win conditions. And both of these put creatures into the graveyard. So I want you to imagine that the game is going long. These things are going to be massive. Like, you can play both of these, funnel a bunch of, tokens, or the tokens are a bad example here, but like you can funnel a bunch of creatures into your graveyard and accrue a very large amount of advantage. Now, as a caveat here, if you, let's say you have 4 creatures in play and you sacrifice one of them in order to go and get your Gaia's Cradle, oh no, your Gaia's Cradle is only tapping for 3 mana, oh no. Right? Like, there is a little bit of negative synergy here. But this is also just something that can also get your utility lands. You have Bojuka Bog. This is a vigilant creature. So you can attack with this big booty Wight of the Reliquary, crash in, get in for 4, 5, 6 points of damage while still just holding up a Bojuka Bog, while still holding up end of turn. Go get an Urza's Saga. Like, there are so many options here for what this card does. I am very, very, very excited for this one. I am not willing to say that this is going to be the best card in the set or anything, because we've seen 10 cards, but this card is insane. I expect to see a lot more green-black Fiend Artisan Elves, green-black rock decks. Maybe this is enough to bring back Maverick into the spotlight. This card is very strong. I'm super hyped about this one. Okay, the next one is one that I'm very excited about, but more for selfish reasons. Chthonian Nightmare. Sort of etymology lesson here. Chthonian is a word that's Greek in origin, and chthonic means usually associated with things under the ground, like the underworld. So if you have chthonic goddesses or chthonic gods, those are gods of the underworld. So this is underworld nightmare is the idea. When this enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy counters. You may pay X energy and sacrifice a creature, return Chthonian Nightmare to its owner's hand. Return target creature with mana value X exactly mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. Now, for you old heads out there who have been around a while, this is a fixed version of a card that is currently banned in Legacy. Let's talk about our good friend Recurring Nightmare for a minute. This is one of my favorite cube cards of all time. So, same mana cost. Oh wait, no, it's more expensive. Yeah, so this is 2 and a black versus 1 and a black. Sacrifice a creature, return Recurring Nightmare to its owner's hand, return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. So let's talk about Recurring Nightmare. This card is sweet. It is notoriously difficult to answer. The reason being kind of how priority works. All right, let's make myself big for a minute here. Okay. So, you cast Recurring Nightmare. Recurring Nightmare resolves. You now have priority. With the way Recurring Nightmare is worded, returning it to your hand is done at the point of cost, okay? So, you cast your spell, it's on the stack, it can be countered. Once it's in play, you have priority before your opponent does. So at sorcery speed, which is the next time that you have priority, you can return that to your hand, and your opponent never has an opportunity to actually use a removal spell on it before it's actually in hand. Your opponent can be sitting there with their Abrupt Decay or whatever that could answer it, but this notoriously just is very difficult to remove. Recurring Nightmare is fundamentally a different card. This is going to be a little bit slower, but this can return anything. Let's take a look at our Chthonian Nightmare again. This also can only be activated as a sorcery. Just like Recurring Nightmare, this gets returned to your hand in the same way so that it can effectively dodge removal. But you are going to be more limited on what you can actually return. Now, if you are always going to return something with, mana value 3 or less, like you're good, you have nothing to worry about. But if you want to use Recurring Nightmare as a way to go and return, your Archon of Cruelties, your Grizzlebrands, or whatever, you are probably not actually going to get a chance to go and do that. Now, you could accumulate energy over time, or you could use other cards that accumulate energy, but when's the last time you saw a card that produced energy in Legacy? Was it me when I played some bad deck? Might have been. So this is a neat way. This is a very sort of mana efficient way to return things from the graveyard repeatedly. And I want to focus on repeatedly there. If you are only trying to return things one time, if all your stuff is small, like you've got Unearth that can just do that for a mana less. If you are only trying to return things one time, why not just reanimate so that you can also target things in your opponent's graveyard and also hit things that are randomly going to be big? I am unsure whether or not Chthonian Nightmare is going to pass the bar for playability. My heart wants it to be good. My mind is skeptical, but this card is incredibly exciting because it's like a thing that is banned in Legacy. Like, there's a lot of parallels here. This is probably going to be obnoxious to play against, and it's like imagine this with Orcish Bowmasters, just kind of like low hanging fruit. So you Orcish Bowmasters, you ping your opponent, you attack for 2, you play Chthonian Nightmare, you sacrifice your Orc token, you return some creature to play, and then the next turn you attack with both those creatures, you sacrifice your Bowmaster, return some other thing, another turn down the line, you return the Bowmasters. Like, this is going to be very good with things that produce multiple bodies and other things that have graveyard synergy. This is going to be in the same draft format as Wight of the Reliquary, and I can see the Golgari gears turning in the designer's hands. This is super cool. So there's like yet another one of these cards that probably finds its home in Golgari decks, and that is Nethergoyf. Obvious name is obvious. Drawing on Tarmogoyf, drawing on other graveyard-oriented cards like Nether Shadow that just come back from the graveyard. So this is a pseudo-Tarmogoyf. Its power is equal to the number of card types among cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number plus 1. So as a 1-mana card, this is going to start the game out small and become increasingly large as the game goes on. Lands, instants, sorceries are traditionally pretty common and very easy to get into the graveyard. So if you are doing this in some sort of, like bug shell, the first 3 types are going to be relatively easy, and from there, you have to work a little bit. Now, the thing that maybe puts this over the top into legacy playability is the fact that this can come back later. You can escape this for 2 colorless and a black, and you also have to exile any number of other cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. So imagine that you are playing against some non-white based control deck. Like let's say they are trying to gun down your creatures with lightning bolts and friends. If a creature goes to the graveyard, it grows the Nethergoyf. If the Nethergoyf goes to the graveyard, it can eventually come back. And I think there's a couple of good comparisons for this card. And I have these cards here for 2 very different reasons. So in terms of number of card types in the graveyard, I think Dragon's Rage Channeler is the important comparison, because this starts getting good once you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. And I think that's about the point where we really start being excited about Nethergoyf as well. If you have a 1-mana card that has 2 power, I sleep, right? Like those are your Isamarus of the world. They're not normally very exciting. If you have a 1-mana card that has 3 power, that's usually the bar for legacy, right? That's where your flipped Delvers come in. That's where your deliriumed Dragon's Rage Channelers come in. That's usually the good rate. And if you get that 4th type in the graveyard, now you are doing something that is actively above rate. And like from play patterns in Legacy, we know it is very easy to get instant sorcery land in your graveyard. And that 4th one is often the point where you have to start doing some work. You have to start putting some baubles into your deck lists. Every once in a while you will see someone doing some sort of self-mill stuff. Surveil triggers matter. So we maybe shouldn't expect Nethergoyf to come out of the gates swinging super hard, but this is incredibly mana efficient. So in the mid game, like this card is going to be massive. And in a fetch land format, even if you just have the fetch land in the graveyard, this immediately is outside of range of being pinged by Orcish Bowmasters, which is a massive thing for this format, because Bowmasters is 40% of the format here. And I think another card that it's like useful to compare this to is to Stalactite Stalker. So this is a card that scales up once per turn, assuming that you are descending, which is usually pretty easy to do in Legacy. And this one has some evasion, this one has some other text as well. And I imagine that the other text on Stalactite Stalker doesn't come up that much. Like, it's a thing, you do it sometimes, but you're playing it for the scaling body. And I think you play Nethergoyf for the scaling body, with the upside that once every few games you will end up escaping it. I don't think it is going to be much more frequent than that. Another thing that this can do is allow mono black aggro decks to just have an absurd number of early drop threats. Like, you can play this alongside Stalker and Douthie Voidwalker and Bowmasters, and then you can start getting into some of the playable 3 drops as well, your Gixes, your Exsanguinator Cavalries, or whatever. And then you round out the deck with like Troll, Reanimate, Grief, maybe a couple utility lands. If you put Urza's Saga into that deck, that puts a land and an enchantment into the graveyard for Nethergoyf. Like, there's some very real possibilities for doing creative deck building in a mono black or maybe even a Delver style shell that take advantage of this card. I don't think this one is format changing or anything, but this definitely seems playable to me at the very least. The next one is neat. It's a little situational, but it's very neat. Null Elemental Blast. This costs a colorless mana, and in case you aren't familiar, when it has the diamond symbol, it has to be a colorless mana. It is not a generic mana. It has to be a colorless mana. And you can either counter target multicolored spell or destroy target multicolored permanent. So You know how there's some very powerful control cards that all happen to be multicolored? Think your Teferi Time Ravelers, think your 4th Aerlingas. This is a way to answer those cards. And that's pretty intriguing. Null Elemental Blast is probably something that you don't want to main deck, but if you have like problem cards, this can answer that. And a decent number of decks are already playing lands that produce colorless, be that like Wasteland or Urza Saga, City of Traders, whatever. Now, if you've been around Legacy long enough, you have probably seen Painter's Servant being used alongside Red Elemental Blast. You use your Painter's Servant to go and turn everything into blue cards, and then your Red Elemental Blasts serve as a generic counterspell or Vindicate for whatever it is that you need. Well, you can do the same sort of thing with Null Elemental Blast as you can with those, assuming that your card starts out as a different color other than what Painter's Servant is already on. If the card is red and you have Painter on blue, that's 2 colors, Null Elemental Blast can counter it. If the card is blue and Painter is on blue, Null Elemental Blast is not countering that. This is something that I see that like maybe sees a little bit of fringe Legacy play. I think this is cool design more than it is a powerful card. Maybe I'm wrong. All right, the next one is a free counter spell. So we have our next Force of Will, Force of Negation cycle here in the form of Flare of Denial. So at its baseline, this is a 3-mana counter target spell, which is not Legacy playable. You barely even see actual factual counter spell at blue to counter any spell. The important part here is that you may sacrifice a non-token blue creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost. And you can do this to counter target spell. Within the context of Legacy, I don't know that I'm excited about this. The biggest problem is that you need to be playing blue creatures that you want to sacrifice. And about the only creatures that I want to sacrifice that are blue are Merfolk, because Merfolk are all bad. So in order to play this, I would need to be playing Merfolk in my deck. So that's going to get a pass from me, dog. I think this is an absolutely disgusting card in some other formats, though. Like this has like CEDH written all over it to me, where like you have some cheap commander that you could just play out, and now you can sacrifice your commander to counter target spell, and you just have one more way to protect your combo turn that's free. This seems much more exciting to me in a 100 card format where you can't just go and play 4 Force of Wills, 4 Force of Negations, 4 Fluster Storms, 4 Dazes to back up whatever combo that you want to back up. This is going to be a modern legal card though, right? So maybe within the context of that format, this is now exciting. Unlike Force of Negation, this can fight on your own turn. So like if you do have, something like a Merfolk in play that you don't need, your Curse Catcher or whatever, your Tide Shaper, whatever bad Merfolk that you play out early to just attack with, this can counter the board wipe that is going to mess you up. This can counter your opponent's card. This is a just generic counter spell. There is not a timing restriction. There is not a type of card that it can counter restriction. The baseline you need is like you need a creature that you are willing to sacrifice. I don't think this is going to get shoved into decks like Delver. I don't think they have enough blue creatures, right? Like the Delver decks right now have some number of Dragon's Rage Channelers, some number of Orcish Bowmasters. Occasionally you'll see Stalactite Stalkers. Like there's enough variety in creature types, and some of your creatures are incredibly valuable. I think your Murktide Regents to the point where you don't necessarily want to sacrifice them. So this one is on my radar of like, yeah, this will see some Legacy play. It'll probably see a good amount of Modern play, and I feel like this is going to be all over the place in Commander. And the final card that I'm going to talk about here is one of my favorites. Phelia, Exuberant Shepherd. So this is a 2/2 flash dog. Whenever Phelia, Exuberant Shepherd attacks, exile up to one other target non-land permanent. At the beginning of the next end step, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If it entered under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Phelia. So, reading comprehension check again. This is exile up to one other target non-land permanent. It does not say that you control. The you control part comes later, where you get a bonus if it enters the battlefield under your control. So this card feels absolutely fucking batshit bonkers to me. I am incredibly excited to try this card. So, this is a 2/2 flash creature. You play it at the end of your opponent's turn. They don't know it's coming. Guess what? I attack. I knock all the counters off your Murktide region. Fuck you. I attack. I blink your Urza Saga token. Fuck you. I attack. I blink your other token of any kind. I blink your 2020 Merit Lage token. Even when it's not that good, you just take their attacker out of the way. Also, assuming that you can keep this thing alive in combat, this is a Soul Herder that costs 2 mana instead of 3 mana. So, like, historically, I'm not the biggest fan of Esper Vial. I just find that deck slow and clunky and not particularly competitive. But the advantage that a Soul Herder generates over time is just absolutely absurd. And Phelia can start coming in and coming in on less mana and come in sooner off an Aether Vial and can do some pretty disgusting things. So let's focus on the last part for a minute. So if the thing enters under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Phelia. So what that means is that Phelia is going to scale up over time, assuming that you are just kind of doing your thing. You'll need some removal. You'll need something to make sure that it can get through. But assuming it does, like after 2 blinks, you are outside of range of Lightning Bolt, for example. Like this is super, super cool. And assuming that you are putting a bunch of cards with good ETB triggers in your deck, you know, your Griefs, your Solitudes, your Orcish Bowmasters, your Flicker Wisps, Blade Splicers, whatever, this seems very powerful to me. And it seems like the sort of card that might be a bit of a sleeper. Because, like, at its base, it is a 2/2 body. Like, you are going to have to work to get it through. But, you know, you could bounce a Leyline Binding, Trapped in the Ice style card, Chained to the Rock style card that can just, like, junk something, reset what it is doing. Like, this card is cool. And this is not even getting into the cute things where it's like, oh, okay, I'll bounce my One Ring to remove the counters on it so that I don't take a bunch of damage. This card is super, super neat. I'm getting one for EDH purposes for sure. And I hope to try to break this card in Legacy. So here's the thing about everything that I just did. Everything that I just did was purely cards that were officially spoiled today. That is April 30th. This is 1 day worth of cards, folks. This is not a complete set review. This is not everything that is coming from Modern Horizons 3 that has the potential to shake up Legacy. This is 1 fucking day worth of stuff. And this is crazy. I am so hyped for Modern Horizons 3. Like, yeah, I was kind of passively hyped about it, but now it's real. It's coming. And I would love to hear what your thoughts are down in the comments below. If you think I've evaluated something wrong, if you think I didn't talk about something that I should have talked about, I would very much love to hear that. And for those of you who want to financially support the channel, it's a great time to do a dealer's choice donation deck list or a tier 1 or I guess it's tier 2 deck list that says build around X card. That is a great way to support the channel, and I'm very much looking forward to playing with a bunch of broken cards as soon as I have access to all of these things. Folks, with that being said, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. See ya!